We are going to be chatting about some of the recent SaaS breaches and the kind of SaaS threat landscape. By way of quick introductions, I am Christie Terrell. I'm the CISO here at Bishop Fox. And we're chatting with Brian Soby. Brian is the CTO and co-founder at App Omni. He was formerly at Salesforce as Director of Product Security. So some of these recent issues we've seen, he has a long history with this part of the industry. This is just kind of fireside chat style. I'll be asking Brian some questions. There you have the ability to ask us questions, and they'll be put in through the Q&A chat for us to answer. But to kick it off, I'd just like to start with thank you, Brian, for joining us. And what we're talking about today is some of these recent SaaS breaches that have impacted things at more of a platform level. And you wrote an excellent write-up. It's cross-posted on LinkedIn and our websites, a great blog post about the impact of these particular recent breaches. But could you give a quick recap for the audience here about what was significant about what's happened recently and why are they so disruptive?
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me as well. What we're seeing are two concurrent different attack groups, both targeting the Salesforce ecosystem, but not limited to that. They're going outside it. They're going to Google, Microsoft, some other places. The first is one called UNC 6040, otherwise known as Shiny Hunters. What we saw them doing was both credential attacks as well as phishing of users, typically administrators within the Salesforce ecosystem. They have become a little bit more sophisticated in that they have learned how to use LinkedIn for better targeting. The voice phishing was optimized. They were doing OAuth phishing using device code flow, which is a little easier to phish because as a bad guy, you get the token back directly. And they were after large amounts of data. When they get access, they grabbed a whole bunch of data as fast as they could, and they were using extortion and ransom and the things that you've seen a lot in other ecosystems. I think that started around June or January. But then a couple of months after that, we saw another one, UNC 6395, and they were focused on credentials. So this was interesting. It's rumored to be a nation state actor. And what they found and what they realized was that credential management within Salesforce particularly is rough. It's kind of a mess. And so they managed to get access to a application called SalesLoft Drift. And Drift was plugged into a whole bunch of stuff. They had 40 some odd different connectors for different applications, but almost always they were plugged into Salesforce. Very often they were plugged into your Google or your Microsoft. But what we saw, at least in the Salesforce ecosystem, is that they had figured out that credential problem, and they knew that credentials are scattered everywhere. And so they very tactfully, to be honest, went after those credentials in a sneaky way. They knew that Drift was coming from AWS, so they came from AWS. They didn't do the normal thing that we would see with, they grab some access and they come from Tor or VPNs. They came from commercial providers, AWS, DigitalOcean, and that's kind of unusual in the ecosystem. They also knew where to look for credentials, probably better than their victims knew when their victim tried to contain it. So two very interesting actors. The level of sophistication really ramped up over the course of a couple of months. And I think at least with Drift, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, so I want to talk or ask you a bit more about the Drift one. For the companies that were using Drift, what was that immediate impact to them by having that platform revoked? And of course, let's talk about the state of SaaS integrations and applications, but let's use this as an example. I mean, you're using Drift, it gets, it gets shut down basically. What does that do to you as a business?
I mean, there's a reason that you have these applications is to help your sales process, help your predictions, help your Salesforce automation and other things. So if there is a vendor compromise, the first thing that you run into is you have to disconnect that particular application until you figure out what's going on. Never mind the large scale disruptions that you get when 40 people get involved in triaging and trying to contain an actual incident, trying to figure out what was taken. In the case of Drift, it spread to other systems, so you'd now have to get all your other IT groups involved that own those other systems. So a lot of disruption in general, but also you don't have access to the application that you probably built business process around and you were depending on to be there because it rolls up to your board level reporting, or it goes into your tactical day-to-day sales automation. Just the lack of that is a big challenge.
So, I mean, we don't usually see full platform compromises like this. The drift situation impacted, hundreds of customers very quickly. And it's easy to start pointing blame, pointing fingers on like, well, who caused this? And is it a fault of the vendor and the product? Is it a fault of our configuration or our lack of monitoring? Where do you say in this situation the responsibility really lies?
So ultimate responsibility has to lie with the vendor that was compromised. This one, I saw an article, I don't know how true it is, saying that the initial vector for this was the attacker got access to employee credentials within Drift's GitHub. And then they found AWS keys for their hosting environment in GitHub, use that to get to the Drift product infrastructure in GitHub. And then, from there, you have access to everything. They looked in the database, they could decrypt stuff, whatever they needed to do to spread out from there. There's no argument to say that that is not the primary responsibility of the vendor. There are other ways it could have happened, certainly, but that vendor needed to manage their own supply chain, not even really supply chain, but their ecosystem risk, their own GitHub. It shouldn't have been just user password. They should have had MFA, mandatory single sign-on, something like that. They should have been monitoring their AWS environment better to recognize when somebody got access. There are a few things in there, but it's also vendor risk management is a thing as a customer, like it exists. And so if you plug in these different applications as a customer, there's basic containment diligence that you need to do. Where should you be coming from? Like, yes, the drift attackers in part came from AWS, but different AWS. Did you pay attention when you integrated it to what they had access to? Because a lot of the secrets that they grabbed, they had no business even being provisioned that access. It's the customer's responsibility to make sure that their integration is on a least privilege basis. And that would have been a massive mitigation in Drift. It's the customer's responsibility to say, we are going to lock down these service accounts such that they can only come from authorized places. That would have been a 100% mitigation to Drift. So it is shared. I'm not going to say that it's not ultimately the vendor's responsibility for being breached, but the customer had a role.
So the customers who weren't impacted, like who weren't themselves compromised, that's because of their good practices in their implementation.
Yes. And we saw that in our own customer base, because all those good practices, if you're diligent in SaaS security, you know to do those. Or if you have a platform that is a SaaS security platform and it's telling you do this, do this, do this, you will have done those things. You can also try detection. So you can do a combination of both posture and configuration management as well as detection. Drift was a lot sneakier than most. So it's better if detection wasn't your primary recourse and posture was your primary goal there. But absolutely, if you did your job as a customer, you would not have been impacted by Drift.
Okay, so because as I was researching this, I saw the most blame kind of put onto the design choice of persistent OAuth tokens. Say, well, that wasn't a good choice by Drift, and like that's kind of the root cause. But I feel like we expect and want a lot from our vendors, of course, but sometimes there's not as many options as we want for functionality and cost and integrations. And so, I mean, was the persistent OAuth token choice, is that by itself, would you say, a bad design choice, or just something that has to be mitigated by these other measures?
So I've seen that a lot, particularly kind of the identity side people saying, hey, you should have had credential rotations, short-lived tokens, all this other stuff. Let's be honest. The state of the world today is OAuth tokens that have refresh and access tokens. You can turn down the access token lifetime as long as you want. It doesn't really matter. You can have a process to rotate refresh tokens. But in the real world, you don't leave your integrations broken. So at any given point, your integrations would have whatever the current token is. And so if you were rotating, let's say you rotated your refresh tokens every day, which is crazy. Nobody does it. In your access tokens, the lifetime is 3.5 minutes. Nobody really does that either. Let's say you did that. The vendor Drift would have had an updated refresh token. Otherwise, the integration would have been non-functional. That's not realistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was a full platform compromise. even if they had access to, if they got access to the access token and the refresh token, um, there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have access to the OAuth client secret in order to use the refresh token to get another access token. It was a full platform compromise. So people talk about that because that is, those are the tools that they have available, within their product platform. Generally, they do token rotation or they do something like that. So they're saying, this would have been a great mitigation. But the reality is we don't break our integrations. And if you fully compromise the vendor platform of the integration, you're going to have everything. And if the tokens are short-lived, yet the vendor has the ability to get a functional token, which you'd expect for an integration, then guess what? The attacker has the same ability to do the same thing. So I see that a lot. A lot of it's, to me, kind of fantasy land. Somebody references some future OAuth. That's not even an RFC, like a draft OAuth spec. It's like, oh, this would have solved it. We don't live there. We live where we are today.
So as a knee-jerk reaction, even for companies who were not impacted by the drift situation, but trying to prevent something similar from happening to themselves, probably wouldn't recommend just go look at what kind of tokens your integrations are using. It's like what would be the right next steps to mitigate against similar SaaS-based SaaS integration platform level attacks?
So I'd say the first is understanding where especially your integrations, understanding where your integrations are coming from. And this is going to be a little different with Shiny Hunters and UNC 6040, but something like Drift, if you have vendors that won't give you dedicated IPs just for them, then you need to honestly flog them until they do so. There's no excuse. It's a $10, $20 a month per IP for the vendor, and then maybe a little bit more platform charge to sort of route everything through this NAT gateway or whatever it is. But the customers can have confidence that the vendors are going to be coming from the same place. What we saw with Drift is that they took the credentials and then they accessed them from the similar platform, but they didn't do it through the Drift instance itself. So they came from different IPs. It's still probably AWS East or whatever, but it's still different. It's because it's really, really noisy. If they compromise a platform and they pull all the data through the platform, then any even basic level controls within that platform environment will see that. They'll see a bunch of weird stuff, see a bunch of data being pulled. So typically we don't see them trying to compromise customers from the exact same instance that they just compromised. So customers should always be IP restricting all of their integrations in all cases. There are very few reasons not to do so. The vendors that don't want to provide customers that ability, they just need to address as a vendor risk problem, because it is. They're creating that risk. The other is understand what you have access to. We see a lot of integrations that are connected with clearly inappropriate access. And so, for example, you'll see integrations that have the ability to access all your data as well as administer things like users. Well, it's either a data application or it's like an identity application. It's very rarely going to be both. So those should be really big red flags. When people see that, they know. Why did you give Drift the ability to go pull secrets out of a whole bunch of different object tables to which they have no reasonable need to access? It was ridiculous, but that's what we saw. We saw that they just said, whatever, it's an integration, throw it on that one profile that says access to everything. And yeah, that means it's all or nothing. If you're a customer and you do have a compromise, and that is the poor state of management of your integrations, then a compromise of an integration means a full compromise to you. And that nobody wants that. You just have to pay a little bit of attention and say, what should this actually be doing? And let's make sure it can only do that. And that's for Drift, it would have been a 50 to 75% mitigation had they just done least privilege. 100% had they done IP restrictions and locking it down to just Drift.
So where would an organization start on that journey? Let's say you're coming in, you're a new CISO, new security leader, you're at a new org, or you're inheriting a lot of past decisions, past integrations. How does someone figure out where all the previous integrations have been authorized?
Yeah, inventory is the first thing. To have some way to say, I need to know everything that is plugged into my major web of applications, because that fundamentally that's the way it works. Is your big applications, your Salesforce, ServiceNow, M365, Workdays, like those are your critical applications. Those are what have the keys to the kingdom. There's a reason the bad guys go after that and not some random project management app that nobody's ever heard of. They want to go to where the data is. They want to go to those things. And so the first thing customers should know is, what do you have plugged in to those keys of the kingdom applications? Build out that inventory. And then once you have that, cross-reference that with your vendor security team, because chances are your vendor security team isn't aware of those sales prediction applications that your sales manager put on a credit card because it didn't go through procurement or it didn't go through legal. You actually have to see it from the systems themselves. It's the only way to get a real source of authority. With Drift, we saw a lot of POCs that happened years and years ago that clearly only were active for a few weeks, yet Drift still had active and valid credentials. It had chosen not to use them for 5 years, but they were still valid. Mm-hmm. The vendor security team has no idea because they thought that POC ended. They didn't realize it never got disconnected. So you need to go to the systems themselves and find out what's connected, build that inventory, and then go through your checklist and say, do we have these properly restricted to only what they should do? Do we have these properly restricted to only where they should be coming from? And just some other basic diligence.
Yeah. I mean, you make it sound very simple, but as we know, it's complicated, especially because these are critical platforms, right? Salesforce and Workday and things like that. You can't just, not can't, but like I know we feel this way sometimes. Teams feel very afraid of just turning things off because they seem to be not in use or seem to be not necessary, because you're gonna just find out by breaking things. So I know it's a correct, I believe you, and I think it's a correct guidance, but it can be scary and complicated. We have a question. Sorry, go ahead.
I do a lot of these systems, especially the ones that have been around for 20 years and that have that are so configurable that you can put any conceivable business process on them. A lot of them, there is a lot of deep voodoo that I am glossing over. Like, it is hard to go figure out everything that's plugged into everything, especially if you have to do it manually. If you have to do it manually, it's not going to happen. If you have tooling, it helps a lot. If you have tooling that's designed to do that, it helps even more. It's certainly challenging, and every system is different because the way you do it in Salesforce is totally different than the next system, which is totally different than the next system. It can be a lot to manage.
Right. I think people get very excited about a lot of these integrations because they make things easier for us, right? And they attach systems together that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But then it's obscured to us sometimes about exactly how that works. And this might be unfair to characterize it this way, but when you were talking about things, how they were integrated or configured initially, I was thinking about how we all read through those privacy statements on downloading an app on our phone, and like how our data is going to be used. And to your point about like access to your contacts, access to your microphone, access to your camera. And sometimes you're just like, yeah, fine. You say yes, or you say no, and then you don't get to use that app. And I think that's where companies sometimes feel not stuck, but it's just, you have something that you want to use for a certain functionality, and then you willingly or not willingly make compromises on some of the detail and nuances of configuration because you're just trying to make it work. You're just trying to get access to something, a functionality. It's still not fair to say, gloss over it. But so we have a couple questions in the chat from some of the audience members. So one is, would Depop support from SalesLoft and Salesforce have been a strong mitigation for this attack?
I would be very surprised because it's a platform compromise. If they had access, hopefully some of what was stolen from Drift was also encrypted at the application layer. Hopefully they were not putting OAuth tokens and other tokens just straight in the database, encrypted at like a partition level. It would be unreasonable if they were doing that. So my assumption is that they had whatever encryption at rest, and then they also had application level encryption of those tokens. That's another situation where you were like, hey, I need a key that exists not in the data level, but at the app level. It's kind of the same as Depop. Like, you need a signing key. You need a signing key and the ability to do something, probably at the database level, like grab whatever some configuration parameters are at the database level, and then grab your signing key from the app environment or vault level. If they can do it, if they can decrypt the OAuth tokens using a combination of database and app or vault level stuff, then they could probably just do Depop. The concept of, and I see this a lot too, where people, we saw it with MCP, so much with MCP, where people are like, oh, but let's separate the authorization server from the resource server. And it's the authorization server that should be making the decision and the resource server just respecting it. Like that, look, every application out there today is both an authorization and a resource server. We are kidding ourselves if we're pretending that we're going to wedge an IDP in between every communication of everything. Like I know the whole IAM space wants to do that, but that's simply not the reality of applications as they exist. So Salesforce has its own authorization server in addition to being a resource server. Rinse repeat for all these other applications. And if somebody had a full platform compromise of Drift, they also had the ability to grab the signing key for Depop.
So another question from the chat that I kind of want to, I'll repeat it, but I want to maybe reframe it is what best practices can we realistically require of our vendors who request OAuth token access? We already tackled that a little bit about the OAuth token question. I would frame it as, is there an opportunity for our SaaS app vendors to kind of promote what they are doing for best practices as any kind of differentiator? Or do you see all of this as this is a minimum, kind of a minimum bar we should expect from vendors? Or is there a way to differentiate on what vendors are providing?
No, I think there are reasonable things that platform providers, that SaaS vendors can do. We see this with the upcoming CSA SaaS controls framework. It's saying, hey, there is this baseline set of capabilities that SaaS applications must have. For example, make it clear which accounts are integration accounts and which accounts are people accounts. We go back to inventory, like find out what's plugged in. Realistically, at least in Salesforce, there's no strong differentiation between a human account and a non-human account at the Salesforce level. You just have to figure it out. It's like, oh, by naming convention, or maybe the integrations have this one perm that I can infer is an integration. So platform providers can most certainly do things to make it easier, not necessarily at the OAuth token level, well, part of it, but make it easier for customers to properly manage their systems. That's exactly what that CSA SaaS controls framework outlines. At the OAuth level, I think the best practice is understood. Scopes, for example. Salesforce doesn't realistically have OAuth scopes. They have one called like data. And it's like, does it have access to data? Yes, and every single application that is not logged in with Salesforce is going to request that. The rest of them are more or less nonsense. It's like, oh, can it run flows? Who cares? Like we're talking about a data integration. It doesn't matter that you have 18 scopes for 18 irrelevant things. Everybody's going to ask for the one thing that says data via API. They could have implemented something better there. Now, read write, not necessarily, because a lot of these are confidentiality breaches. And so a read scope is a read scope. I don't know how they would better segment which elements of their data get broken down into scopes, but there are a couple things that they could have done at the OAuth token level. But really, it's about build the features in to help your customers understand what's happening better so they can better manage it.
Back to, I don't want to harp on this, but back to the OAuth question specifically, if an organization suspects that their OAuth tokens have been compromised for some reason, what would be the first step that they should take?
Definitely revocation. The biggest challenge with Drift is that the Drift attackers knew how to find the credentials better than the customers. I'm speculating, but those companies that put out breach reports like 3 or 4 days later, I don't believe personally that they found all of the credentials that they had compromised. Because like I said, secrets management in Salesforce is kind of a mess. And it's hard to go find all of the credentials. The attacker knew how to find them. Customers don't.
Right.
So it's like the bad guy knew where to go grab them all. And they may be using them. You took 3 days with fairly superficial knowledge of the platform and try to figure it out yourself. I bet there are credentials that weren't rotated that we're going to see in the coming months, and we're going to see it in the form of there was an unstated third party that was compromised, and that led to this other breach over here. They're not going to attribute it to anything. We're just going to see follow-on breaches that come from some unmentioned third-party source.
So do you think this is more of a one-off situation, or do you really see this as a kind of canary in the coal mine of a predictor of more large-scale SaaS platform compromises like this to be common? It's hard to predict the future, but what do you think?
And they were both wildly successful.
Right.
And so if you're putting your bad guy hat on, trying to find the model to put your efforts in the future, following widely successful patterns of attack is not an unreasonable plan.
Well, you mentioned something in your blog post about it, about how even the maturity between these two attacks shows evolution. I mean, there are different threat groups, but there's it's already showing an evolution of maturity and how these attacks were executed. So, it makes me think whether it's, there's all not all bad actors are the same, and some are more mature than others, but are they just getting ahead of organizations and enterprises on, to your point, like their expertise on how and where to find some of these secrets and credentials?
I think people realize how much benefit they get from doing just a little bit of homework. Shiny hunters realized it with device code flow. I bet half the customers had no idea what an OAuth device code flow was. They didn't know that it presented unique, I don't want to say weaknesses, but unique advantage to an attacker during phishing. They probably didn't know of its existence. Shiny hunters did a little bit of homework and they said, it'll be easier. Instead of doing this regular phishing, why don't we add this thing where they only need to put in a code that we give them and then click OK? Like, that sounds pretty innocent. Let's try that. So they did a little bit of homework and had wild success. Drift did a little bit of homework. If we wanted to, pull a full supply chain compromise, like we saw like SolarWinds, it's a very similar field to SolarWinds. If we want to pull that, let's do a little bit of homework to figure out how we can get passwords and credentials and secrets out of this particular platform. And they were wildly successful in doing it. To me, like that, you see this on Bug Bounty all the time. Bug Bounty, somebody hits a particular application and then 1,000 eyes turn to that application. And then they just get teed off on because people realize that you can have a lot of success digging in a little bit in this particular area or this one company's product.
Yeah, gotcha. As a final question, I just want to ask you for like a simple takeaway. And this is actually coming from, even our organization being not a large enterprise scale organization. We have small teams, we have to be smart about our time and our resources. So what's the most practical, like whether it's lowest cost or effort, I mean, just like the next step an organization should take if they're worried about this, without making it sound like this is an overwhelming strategic initiative they now need to like kick off? What would you recommend is like the next thing an organization should do if they're wondering how vulnerable they could be to similar issues?
I'd say modernize their vendor risk management process a little bit. Okay. Instead of looking for contracts, instead of looking for purchase orders and things like that, like those are things that the company has adopted in full. Great. What about all the rest of the actual risk? The trials, the POCs, the things that were free to sign up for that one of your users signed up for? Because a lot of these platforms, users can connect stuff and that's it. That's the same level of risk for you as an official, documented, contracted integration. Just modernize it and understand where your risks really are and have some basic elements like restricting their access, knowing where they're coming from. Just get out of the paperwork and more into the technology and the applications to make sure it's being done at a meaningful level.
Great, that's helpful. All right, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate always having you on, and this was helpful and interesting for me, and I hope for everyone else. So thanks again.
I appreciate it. Thanks.